Good evening. My name is Micah Frink, and I am so excited about what God has to say to us out of this text. You've already turned to Psalm 131, and so let's read this text tonight before we begin. We're going to be looking at the whole psalm. It's only 3 verses. It's very short, but there's so much meaning packed into it. Here's what it says. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. Psalm 131 is part of the collection of psalms known as the Songs of Ascent. And this collection of hymns, it's got this title. There's still some debate on why it's called this, but the most common explanation is one simply based on geography and tradition. So geographically speaking, Jerusalem sits on a hill. And so if you're coming from anywhere to Jerusalem, well, you're going up. Traditionally speaking, we know that the Jews made a pilgrimage each year for their annual feasts. And so this has led many scholars to the conclusion that these songs of ascent, these collection of hymns, were sung as Jewish pilgrims made their yearly trek up to Jerusalem for the annual feasts. You can just imagine during this time, this long, arduous journey that the people of Israel, coming from all over the place, are anticipating worshiping together as one. So they're singing these hymns, these songs, these spirituals as worship, getting ready for the feast that they celebrate the Lord, they celebrate with their people. If their journey had a soundtrack, it would be this. The collection of psalms known as the Songs of Ascent. These were communal in nature. This is important for us. And so our psalm today that we're reading is part of this collection. It's one of the shortest of the Songs of Ascent. In fact, it's the second shortest, but don't be deceived. Even though it's the second shortest, there's so much meaning packed into these 3 verses, and we're going to be digging into this, unpacking it tonight. So what we'll see from this text is that the psalmist told his congregation to put their trust in God. He illustrated how to do this by his own personal experience of humility and dependence. Now, for us, what does it mean for us? This is our main point. We'll get to it in the end, but let me just say it at the beginning. Like the psalmist told his congregation, we as believers are called also to trust in God by forsaking our pride and choosing a willing dependence on God. So how does that shake out in the psalm? Let's get into it tonight. So in verses 1 through 2, we see the psalmist recount his own personal experience. In verse 1, we see he talks about what he has not done. And in verse 2, we see he talks about what he has done. So what does the psalmist tell us that he's not done? Look with me back in verse 1. That's what he says. He says, O Lord, my heart is what? Not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. Here we see the psalmist recounting his humility. Right? He says his heart's not lifted up. His eyes are not raised too high. What does this mean? This may be the simplest phrase in our whole psalm to look at. Simply put, he's denying pride and arrogance in his life. That's the whole thing. So we move on to the next phrase. He's denied pride and arrogance. What does he say next? What does he not do? He says he does not occupy himself with things too great and marvelous for him. What are these great and marvelous things? These great things, these great matters, marvelous or wonderful things. If we look through the context of the Psalter, we'll see that they're continually used to refer to God's salvific acts with Israel, his salvation acts in regards to his people. So is the psalmist saying that we shouldn't recount or think about God's acts of salvation for his people? I don't think so. I think what he's actually saying is really simple. He's simply confessing the fact that I'm not God and I'm not trying to be. This is what the psalmist is saying. I'm not God and I'm not trying to be. We also see in this phrase, it says, I do not occupy myself, which can literally be translated, I do not walk in. So as this is Old Testament poetry, we shouldn't let the imagery be lost on us, right? He talks about his eyes, his heart, and his feet. So perhaps the psalmist is saying that everything in his existence is defined by humility. But nevertheless, whatever the case, however we feel about that, we see that the psalmist sees himself in perspective. This is what we know. He sees himself in perspective, and that's what it takes to be humble. It reminds me of when I went on my senior trip to New York City. Now, guys, I'm from Plant City, Florida. We've got more strawberry fields than skyscrapers. It is what it is, okay? And so when I stepped off the plane, I could not imagine how tall these buildings were. As tall as you can imagine, and as far as your eye could see, there was buildings. It was gigantic buildings. And I remember we were going to the Empire State Building one day, and we're going to go in there, and we're going to go to the very top. And I remember getting to the precipice of the building and looking up. I couldn't believe it. It was the tallest thing I've ever seen in my life. And in that moment, I felt really, really small. It's because I was in perspective. And that's what we're seeing here in this text. The psalmist sees himself for who he is, but he also sees God for who God is. He sees himself in perspective. And what happens rightfully? He feels humble and small. So we've seen what the psalmist has not done. He's not been proud or arrogant. But what does he tell us that he has done? Look back with me in verse number 2. He says, "But I have calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me." This verse is the richest verse in this psalm. There's so much packed into this beautiful imagery used that just speaks volumes about what our psalmist has done. So this is what he says he's done. It says he's calmed and quieted his soul. Calmed and quieted his soul. This phrase speaks to the contentment of the psalmist's heart. How do we know this? Well, he tells us through a vivid and beautiful word picture. He says, "I've calmed and quieted my soul." How? Like a weaned child with its mother. And he confirms it. He says, "Like a weaned child is my soul within me." Guys, I don't even need an illustration here because the psalmist has already done it for me. He's given us a picture of what he's trying to say. And in this picture, it's so beautiful. He's trying to get the reader to imagine a child who's just been weaned off of his mother's milk. And this was a big event, not for us today, but a big event for them back then. Okay, the child would be about 3 years old. And guess what they'd do? They'd throw a family feast. A little weird, child just being weaned off their mother's milk. Let's throw a feast. But they do it. It was a big event for them. Why? Because it was illustrating that this child is now not directly dependent on his mother for nourishment and life. The child is, in a sense, independent. And yet, the picture that the psalmist paints is a little bit different, isn't it? He paints a picture of this young child, while not being dependent on the mother, still chooses to be with her. He doesn't need her like he once did, but he still seeks the tender embrace of his mother. He's content in her loving arms. What a beautiful picture. And how much more true is it for the children of God? I think what the psalmist is trying to communicate is the importance of contentment for the child of God. See, while the child of God has received everything we need, all that's necessary for life, we still desire that closeness with God. It's a kind of spiritual contentment. It's a willing dependency that brings ultimate intimacy with our Father. A willing dependency that brings ultimate intimacy with our Father. So then we see in verse 2 what the psalmist has done. He has been willingly dependent on God, and as a result, he's experienced spiritual contentment. So now then, what do we do with verse 3? Verse 3 may be the simplest to interpret, and yet I think it has big implications for our life. Let's look back at verse number 3. This is what it says. O Israel, he is addressing the congregation. O Israel, what hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. We see here he now shifts from his personal example to declaring to his congregation. He gives them a challenge. He tells them to put their hope and their trust in the Lord now and in the future. And by extension, this is a communal psalm. By extension, I think for us today, we should also heed the psalmist's exhortation of our lives as well. We ought to put our hope and trust in God now and in the future. That's all well and good, but how should we do this? How can we put our trust in God? How do we do that? It's one thing to say, hey, trust God, but the practicality of it, man, that's where we get a little bit in trouble, but I think it's simple. He's already told us how to put our trust in God. It's in the verses prior. He tells us we should flee from pride and arrogance. Number 2, we should choose a humble, willing dependence on God. Why? Don't miss this. Because pride produces distance, but dependence produces nearness. Pride produces distance, but dependence produces nearness. It's what we've got to do. And isn't it ironic, in a psalm like this, written by a king who had everything you could possibly imagine, had no needs, and yet he realized ultimately contentment, dependence, and trust in God was far greater than anything he could have. If King David could get it, we should too. Men of God, let me remind you, the enemy of our trust in God is our own pride and arrogance. So that leads us to our sentence that we said in the very beginning. We've been building to this. What's the main point? The idea, the takeaway, it's this. Like the psalmist told his congregation, we as believers are called to trust in God. How? By forsaking our pride and choosing a willing dependence on God. This would be where I say, let's pray.